Ratchet & Clank is my favourite series in all of gaming, but nowadays there are so many titles that it might be hard to figure out where to start if you want to get into the franchise. And that is why I'm making this video today. I'm going to guide you through every era of this franchise, from PS2 to PS5, and we'll see where the best place to start is. Now, I'm not going to be covering going mobile or before the Nexus, because those were mobile games that are no longer available to play, and so I thought it'd be kind of useless putting them in this video. I mean, you can play them, I guess, if you really wanted to, but you have to jump through a lot of hoops to get there. Anyway, let's begin with the very first era of the Ratchet & Clank series, which is the PS2 era. And we're starting our journey here with the very first game in the franchise, Ratchet & Clank. Now, this game is actually more of an extension of the Spyro trilogy that Insomniac worked on previously. And so if you know the Spyro trilogy, you know the titular purple dragon used to go around collecting items like gems and orbs and dragon eggs. And to do so, there used to be like home worlds and portals that he would travel through with no loading screens, no obvious loading screens. And on his journey, Spyro would meet NPCs that would give him tasks and reward him for completing those tasks. And exploration was a big factor. Ratchet & Clank is just like that. But we also have a story here that is more significant than the Spyro games, I would say. Clank, a defective warbot, has crash landed on Ratchet's home planet of Veldin. Ratchet is a Lombax, which is a species that gets more interesting as the series goes on. Now, Ratchet here is actually a fan of Captain Quark, who is the local superhero of the Solana galaxy, which is where they live. And Clank also wants to find Captain Quark because he believes he can help stop Drek, who is the evil leader of a race called the Blarg. What Drek wants to do is rip out chunks of planets and combine them into a new homeworld for his race, due to their current homeworld being polluted beyond repair. Now, if you've played the Spyro games, you will already be able to tell that this is more in-depth than any of those games, because I would say the Ratchet & Clank series is made more for teenagers than kids. And the writing here is actually fantastic. The humour is great. It's very satirical, much more so than what it would become in the PS3 era and beyond. And I don't think Sony would ever publish something like this nowadays. Really, this feels like a Saturday morning cartoon that's just bursting with life and energy. The one problem though is that Ratchet can be a bit antagonistic towards Clank at some points in the story. Now, I happen to think that kind of works for his character arc, because he's learning how to actually be a hero like his idol Captain Quark, but at the same time it is a bit much. But what is the gameplay like here? Now, I've said already that it's like Spyro, and what I mean by that is that you talk to NPCs, you explore levels, there are multiple paths, you collect items, and you do a bunch of platforming. But unlike Spyro, you also get to use many different weapons, and this is one of the main draws of the game. If you actually look at the cover art, it features blueprints of all these different weapons that are included in the game. Now, you access these weapons by accessing something called the weapon wheel. Now, I don't think Ratchet & Clank was the first to use the weapon wheel, but it was one of the first. It was one of the original games that did this, and it makes switching weapons so easy. You literally just hold down the triangle button, use the analog stick to select which weapon you want, and you're good to go. Weapons also do this really cool animation where they activate kind of like Transformers. It's really cool. I don't know why I like this so much, but I do. Now, in Spyro, you used to be able to collect gems, and there was a set amount of them per level, but in this game you collect bolts, which act as the currency. That means that there are an unlimited number of bolts, and it is very satisfying to collect them. They've got a really nice sound effect whenever you pick them up. It just feels really satisfying. There are also these things called gold bolts that are scattered around the game world, so they act as special collectibles. They don't really do that much in terms of the actual gameplay value, but it's just nice that they're there. But the game is called Ratchet & Clank, so that means Clank is also playable, and his levels often include commanding little gadgets to progress. Ratchet can also take part in hoverboard races, which are really cool, and there is not a single loading screen in sight because they are covered up by cutscenes of Ratchet's ship flying to its destination, much like Spyro did when you were traveling through portals. Spyro didn't have a ship, but you know what I mean. The main problem I have with the gameplay is the inability to strafe, which is a feature that would be in every other Ratchet & Clank game. Here, you have to get a jetpack ability to strafe, and even that kind of sucks. So it makes combat a bit more difficult to partake in. Ratchet also controls a lot heavier than he would do for the rest of the series. Kind of feels like he's wading through mud sometimes. It's not bad, they're not bad controls, they're just far less nimble than he would become in later entries. The graphics though, they still look good to this day, in my opinion. If you're wondering why they're so sharp on screen at the moment, that's because I'm emulating them. You can actually play the PS3 HD ports of Ratchet & Clank 1 to 4 through PS Plus Premium if you have that subscription, but as I've discussed in a previous video, which I'll link in the card at the top there are a bunch of graphical bugs that I just don't like. They don't harm the gameplay as such, but it just makes it seem really unpolished. I much prefer the PS2 versions. Those were the ones I grew up with. And I also still have those physical versions on my shelf. So overall, this game is great. The story is really entertaining, has fantastic writing. The combat is great apart from the lack of strafing. The exploration really makes you feel like you're exploring a new galaxy. But I do hesitate to recommend it as a starting point purely because of the lack of strafing and how heavy Ratchet can feel in terms of controls. Really, it's essentially the prototype of what this series would eventually become, much like the first Spyro the Dragon game and the first Crash Bandicoot game. Those games are quite different to their sequels, and the same is true here for Ratchet & Clank. Now, I'm not discouraging you from playing the original Ratchet & Clank, far from it, but I'm just trying to look at this from the perspective of someone that hasn't played any game in this series yet. However, if you're totally okay with slightly heavier controls and a lack of strafing, then absolutely start with the very first Ratchet & Clank. It is an absolute classic. Next, we're going to look at Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, which is the second game in the series, and this is where you start to see that the subtitles in the North American versions are quite risque. Insomniac loved their innuendos. Now, this is where Ratchet & Clank really became its own thing. The first game, like I said, was more like Spyro, but in space. This is where Ratchet & Clank became Ratchet & Clank. With more of a focus on action, you have the ability to strafe, Ratchet feels much nimbler to control. It's good stuff. Now, in terms of the story, here Ratchet & Clank are taken to another galaxy to recover a stolen animal called the Protopet for Megacorp, which is a weapons dealing company. Why is a weapons dealing company making an animal for kids? Well, you have to play to find out. This story is a bit more convoluted compared to the first game, but it still has fantastic funny writing and feels like a Saturday morning cartoon. The big change here was that they made Ratchet's personality much less antagonistic towards Clank. He still has a fiery personality, trust me, but he's learned from his experiences in the first game, and he even has a new voice actor, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like I said, strafing was introduced here, and that means combat is so much better. It's so much easier to move around while aiming at your enemies. Weapons can also be upgraded into much more powerful versions by gaining experience, and you can also buy different suits of armor. So there's more depth here to the combat. There's still exploration in these levels though, with multiple paths to explore, but the combat is a much bigger focus, to the point where the game even has 2 arenas where you can test your skills. These are very, very fun additions to the game, and that's evident because the arenas will become a staple of the franchise. Also, look at these Mario Galaxy style spherical levels, years before Mario Galaxy existed. This was actually a big thing at the time. Apparently, 2 people at Insomniac came up with the idea. Brian Hastings, who was at the time Vice President of Programming, was inspired by the cover of a book called The Little Prince. I mean, just look at it. On the other hand, you had Lloyd Murphy, who was a senior artist, who was inspired by watching ants crawl around an apple that he was about to chuck in the trash. He watched those little ants moving around the apple and thought, oh, this apple is like their whole world. What would it be like to be an ant on an apple like that? So they combined their inspiration together. There's a great interview here where they explain that, and also this bit where Brian Hastings says, well, I doubt they're going to be the next gimmick that every other platform game in the world will have next year, like minecart racing or skateboarding that have been in the past. Okay, Mario Galaxy wasn't a year after, but 4 years is pretty close enough. But does Ratchet & Clank Going Commando get any of the credit for that? No. Of course not. Why would it? Going Commando also has space combat. Now, there was dogfighting in the first Ratchet & Clank, but it's much more fleshed out here, to the point where you can take part in different challenges in different locations. There are also hoverbike races, which are sequels to the hoverboard races from the first game. The game also has more planets than Ratchet & Clank 1. It's just a longer game, and it has a couple of levels that are more sandboxy. They give you the option to go out and find collectibles for bolts. There's a lot here in Going Commando, and really I think this would be a great place to start for new fans. Now, I know it feels weird to start with a second game in the series, but you don't need to have played the first game to enjoy it, because every entry in the PS2 series is standalone. The stories don't really link to each other. I said it was like a Saturday morning cartoon, and I do mean that. Saturday morning cartoons have standalone episodes that mean that viewers can jump on at any time. It's the same here with the Ratchet & Clank PS2 games. All you need to know is that Ratchet & Clank are heroes that have saved the galaxy once before. So currently my recommendation is to start with going Commando, but if you are okay with slightly worse controls, go back to the original Ratchet & Clank and start there. Next on our list is Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal, which is my favourite from the PS2 era. Yes, the title is Up Your Arsenal. The story is that Ratchet and Clank have to return to their home galaxy of Solana to stop a supervillain called Dr. Nefarious from eliminating all organic life and replacing them with robots. I think it's probably the best story in this era, with Ratchet and Clank becoming the true superheroes it feels like they were destined to become the whole time. It's still got that biting satire and it's funny as heck. Dr. Nefarious here is such a great villain. He's hilarious and so is his butler Lawrence. There are just so many scenes of them that I've watched so many times and I never get tired of them. Now this game doesn't have things like space combat or races, but it does have vehicles you can control in combat zones. Combat zones are a new addition to this game where you take part in various different challenges in a particular map. Because the story of this game is that the galaxy is at war with the Tyrannoids, who are commanded by Dr. Nefarious. And these combat zones are also the same maps that they used for the multiplayer mode, which is a thing in this game. Or I should say was a thing in this game. I think the multiplayer mode still kind of exists. I think there are like fan recreations of it or something. Fan servers, I don't know. It was never really my thing, I'll be honest. But these combat zones that they put into the single player mode, I think are actually really fun. They made good use of them. There is still tons of exploration in Up Your Arsenal though. Still bolts to collect, gadgets to find, NPCs to talk to. There's even a main hub called the Starship Phoenix, which is where you can do things like VR training. It's where you buy your armor, and it's also where you can get a discount for certain weapons. Because Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal did this cool thing where if you played the previous games in the series, you would get a discount on your weapon purchasing. So in Going Commando, you could buy all of the old Gadgetron weapons from the first game for free if you had already acquired them on your memory card. And then in Up Your Arsenal, you can get a couple of weapons from the second game for free if you'd already acquired them on your memory card. And you get just a general discount for the rest of the weapons if you played the first game. It's a really, really cool system. It's not an absolutely necessary one, doesn't change things really, but it's just a nice little gift for players that stuck with the series. I also want to point out that Ratchet and Clank keep their upgrades from the previous games. So for example, in the first game, Ratchet at first can't breathe underwater, but he later gets an ability that lets him do that, and in Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal, he just has that ability from the get-go. Same with Clank's gadgetry. Clank gains certain gadgets in the first game, and he retains them in Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal. It's the complete opposite of Metroid or God of War. Also, Clank has a pretty big role here because he's now a movie star with a show called Secret Agent Clank, and that'll be important to remember for later. Overall, Up Your Arsenal is a fantastic game, my favourite in the PS2 era, but while I highly recommend it, I think Going Commando is also fantastic, and so you should probably play that one first before going into this game, because it will give you more context as to who Ratchet and Clank are. I know I said the games were standalone, but Going Commando is fantastic, so why wouldn't you play that one first? Right, we're moving on now to Ratchet Deadlocked. This is where Insomniac switched things up. The game is not a traditional Ratchet and Clank experience. It only has Ratchet in the title because Clank isn't playable at all. Instead, he's just the guy in the chair that guides Ratchet. Essentially, this game takes the combat arenas from Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal and expands them into a full-length game. The story is that Ratchet, Clank and Big Al, the character from the first and third games, have been kidnapped by an illegal TV show called Dread Zone. The premise is that heroes fight to the death for the amusement of millions of screaming fans, apparently. So Ratchet, Clank and Al find themselves captured by this evil corporation, and deadlock collars are placed around their necks so they can't escape. Hence the name Deadlocked. And the rest of the story is basically them competing in combat challenges on different planets. Well, Ratchet competing in combat challenges on different planets while they figure out a way to escape. Now, while previous games satirized a bunch of different things, whether it be TV shows or video games or Hollywood, Deadlocked aims its sights squarely on TV and marketing corporations, so it's much more one note in that respect, but I still think it does a really good job. It still has fantastic writing, and there's still a lot of humour involved, even if it is a darker story. I actually think of this game more like Insomniac's version of Crash Team Racing or Jack X Combat Racing. You know how Naughty Dog used to make 3 games and then an experimental game afterwards. This is like Insomniac's version of that. They took a break from the regular gameplay to try something new, something more just entirely focused on combat, because there is no exploration here whatsoever. But with that said, it's still incredibly fun to play. My one problem is that the default control scheme, which is the lock strafe mode, which was introduced in Up Your Arsenal, makes Ratchet look up when he's running forward while firing his dual Vipers. I mean, what's this all about? It doesn't happen in the third person mode. It's just a really weird thing that happens, and it happens in the default control scheme, so I don't know how they missed this when they were playtesting. But the thing about this game is that there is a lot of combat, and it is more difficult, I would say, than going Commando or Up Your Arsenal. So while you can play it first before the other games in the series, because again, these games are standalone, I think a really optimal way of progressing through the PS2 era is starting with Going Commando, then Up Your Arsenal, and then Deadlocked. Or start with the original Ratchet and Clank, then Going Commando, Up Your Arsenal, and Deadlocked, if you're okay with the original game's heavier controls. So these PS2 games are where you want to start if you want to go from the very, very beginning of the franchise, if you want to know its absolute earliest origins. Again, start with the first Ratchet and Clank if you're prepared for heavier controls and no strafing, but otherwise start with Going Commando, which is where the series found its true identity. You can always go back to the original later. So how can you play these games on modern platforms? Well, like I said before, you can play the PS3 ports through PS Plus Premium. Those are, however, limited to cloud streaming, and I know that not every territory has cloud streaming enabled, and that's pretty much it for the modern platforms. If you don't have PS Plus Premium, you're going to have to find used PS2 copies or play the PS3 ports on an actual PS3. You can also emulate the PS2 versions like I did, but I do own the physical copies as well. It's super annoying that these games aren't more readily available. They're first-party Sony games, so why aren't they natively available on PS5? These aren't even the only first-party games that Sony has just left in a void either. It doesn't make any sense. Alright, time to move on to the next era of the Ratchet & Clank franchise, and okay, I'll be honest, these next 2 games, they're not great nowadays. Welcome to the PSP era. While Insomniac worked on the next generation installment of Ratchet & Clank, High Impact, which was made up of former Insomniac and Naughty Dog employees, were contracted to make a PSP entry called Size Matters. This would be a return to the classic style of gameplay after Deadlocked shook things up a little bit. They also released a PS2 version a year later, which is what I use for recording because it's much easier to control. The story is that Ratchet & Clank are chasing a kidnapped girl called Luna, who has been captured by a race of tiny creatures called the Technomites. Captain Quark is also here, looking for his long-lost family. Because it was made for the PSP, there are no dual analog controls because the PSP only had one analog stick, if you can even call this thing an analog stick, and strafing can be a pain as a result. You have to use a directional pad, or you can switch it around so that the analog nub does the strafing and the directional pad does the normal movement. It's not an ideal system, and that's why the PS2 version is better, because it allows you to use the traditional Ratchet & Clank controls. But in both versions of the game, the camera feels like it was shoved right up Ratchet's arse. It's so close to him, it makes it really difficult to just play the game, to just run around and explore. The weapons are weirdly ineffective here, doing so little damage, and I have no idea why. This shotgun should be way more powerful than it is. Look how many shots it takes to take out one of these plants. It's a plant! There's one classic Clank section here, but even though it has an enter command for the gadget bots, they enter their houses automatically, and this is the only time they do so in the entire game, so why is the enter command even here? It's completely defunct. There's skyboarding, which is okay, I guess. It's like hoverboarding, but you can actually fly around a little bit. And there are some different Clank challenges that are a mixed bag overall, I would say. The good thing is that the game does still have a little bit of exploration, so you can still find collectibles like titanium bolts. They only unlock a few skins, but hey ho, it's better than nothing. Look, I just can't recommend playing this game if you're new to the series. I just can't, no way. Don't even touch it if you're new to the series. Only even consider touching this game if you've played the other ones and you enjoy them. I do not want this game to taint your opinion of the franchise, because while I really enjoyed playing this game back when it first released on the PSP, it has not aged well at all. Okay, let's move on to High Impact's second game in the series, which is also on PSP and PS2. I recorded the PS2 version, but this one has ridiculously long load times for some reason. It doesn't even show the ship arriving at a destination like the other games in the series. I don't know why this is a problem on the PS2 version, because the PSP version isn't like that at all. Anyway, Secret Agent Clank has Clank take up the role of an actual secret agent. Not a TV show anymore, this is real life. Clank is actually a secret agent. They must have hired him after the previous games or something. I've seen some people express their bafflement at Clank actually being a real secret agent, saying that it must still be part of the show. But why can't he be a real agent? He can hold his own. We've seen that plenty of times by this point. And these PSP games take place between the PS2 era and the PS3 era, so literally anything could have happened in those years. Anyway, Ratchet has stolen a gem called the Eye of Infinity from the Voltaire Museum, but he doesn't remember doing so. It's Clank's job to find out what really happened and clear his friend's name. You have Clank stages, which consist of regular platforming and brand new stealth sections, as well as rhythm games. These rhythm games are a bit dodgy. Sometimes the timing doesn't line up, which is really bad for a rhythm game. There are also Gadgetbot levels, Ratchet Arena stages, and Captain Quark sections where you play out Quark's ridiculously over-the-top events that he's making up on the spot. He's dictating his supposed biography to a writer, you see. That's why he's doing this. I think there are some cool ideas here, but the camera, again, is shoved right up Clank's arse, making each normal level a pain to play. The other sections are hit or miss as far as I'm concerned. I enjoyed playing them on the PSP back when it released. I actually remember getting this game to play on a cruise around the Mediterranean, and I loved it. I loved playing this game, but nowadays they're less enjoyable. Like size matters, this game just doesn't hold up nowadays. Just don't play either of the PSP entries unless you're interested in the franchise's history. I know it's a bit of a bummer, but yeah, that's the PSP era for you. Now we're moving on, and the next era we're looking at is the PS3 Future trilogy, starting with Ratchet & Clank Future, Tools of Destruction. And finally, I can smile again. Insomniac's first entry in the HD era, Ratchet & Clank Future, Tools of Destruction, is absolutely fantastic. It goes back to the classic formula established by the original game, going commando and up your arsenal, feeling more like a sequel to them than Deadlocked. And that's awesome, but what really changed here though is the story. The PS2 games were standalone, like I've said before, highly satirical Saturday morning cartoons. The PS3 games are more like young adult CG movies with writing that actually tugs on the heartstrings. Here, the planet Kerwan is invaded by the Emperor of the Polaris Galaxy, Tachyon, who wants to eliminate Ratchet. Why? Well, it turns out that Ratchet is now the last living Lombax in the universe, and Tachyon has a huge grudge against them for reasons that will be revealed later in the story. I won't spoil it, but everything here is a great extension of the Ratchet & Clank lore. It's not just Ratchet who gets that treatment either. Clank has his own personal journey that's just as important. So the two heroes escape to the Polaris Galaxy and meet a whole new cast of characters. Captain Quark is still here though, thank goodness. The quality of the writing is a sticking point with some fans though. Tools of Destruction is where things became less satirical and more generic fantasy, and some people don't like that. But honestly, I think what's here is still really good, and there are still loads of funny moments. They don't quite match the humour of the PS2 games, but they're still entertaining. Except for Tachyon. He's the most grating bad guy in the franchise by far. He's got a cool backstory though. I think my main problem with Tools of Destruction is that it doesn't really do much to evolve the formula. You also don't meet that many NPCs compared to the PS2 games, which had so many random characters that made the galaxies feel just alive. Tools of Destruction doesn't really have that in the same way. The game does bring back space combat though, which is awesome. This time they're on-rail shooters taking place in incredibly beautiful set pieces that I love replaying. Tools of Destruction also brings back traditional arena combat, and it's so good. Now, because this was made for a new generation of console and takes our heroes to a brand new galaxy, Tools of Destruction serves as a great starting point for new fans. But like the PS2 games, this is only available through cloud streaming on PS Plus Premium, otherwise you'll have to get an actual PS3 and play it there. It's so annoying, and that goes for every other PS3 game that I'll be talking about. Aside from that, I do think this game is a great place to start if you're looking to get into the series. I'd say that this is where you go if you want more polished graphics and gameplay that's closer to modern standards, and if you're looking for a more traditional epic fantasy story that takes place over multiple entries. So the next game, Ratchet & Clank Future Quest for Booty. Now I say this is a game, but it's actually what I would call a standalone expansion, much like Halo 3 ODST, Infamous First Light, or Uncharted The Lost Legacy. This takes the base foundation of Tools of Destruction and creates a couple-hour experience that continues the storyline. It was meant to hold people over until the next full-length release. Because it follows on directly from the ending of Tools of Destruction, I won't say anything about the story because anything I say would be spoilers. The gameplay is quite different here though. They introduce something called a kinetic tether, which allows Ratchet's wrench to pull distant objects towards him for platforming purposes. It's very satisfying, and every time I play this game I think of Spyro, and that's because they expanded exploration in a big way. Hulafar Island, which is one of the levels, has multiple ways you can go to complete your objectives, and you can speak to a bunch of different NPCs to get hints and learn about the story. Quest for Booty also played around with the lighting system, introducing these green slug things that can illuminate your surroundings. I just remember this being a selling point at the time, because you know, it was still kind of early in the PS3's life cycle and they were playing around with the graphical technology. I'll also say this is very pirate focused. This has strong pirate vibes, this game, but I would not play it until you've played Tools of Destruction, because obviously the story is an expansion of Tools of Destruction, but it is worth your time and very fun to boot. And now we move on to Ratchet & Clank Future, A Crack in Time. Oh man, this is so many people's favourite game in the series. Where do I even begin? The story follows on directly from the previous two, so I'll try not to spoil anything major, but it has fantastic writing that's much closer to an epic fantasy movie, just like Tools of Destruction, but it's much better here. Not that Tools of Destruction was bad, but this is just a much better story. It's still dealing with Ratchet & Clank's personal histories, so there's lots of emotional moments. And actually, now I'm thinking about it, it's probably my favourite story in the franchise. I know I said that some people don't like the reduced satire that the PS2 games had, but again, like Tools of Destruction, I think it more than makes up for it in just being a great, well-rounded tale that hits all the right emotional beats. And it still has a lot of funny moments. A lot of funny moments.
You win again, technology!
Okay, I know I said I would avoid spoilers, and I will, but I can't avoid saying that Dr. Nefarious is back. That means this is a sequel to Up Your Arsenal, as well as Tools of Destruction and Quest for Booty. So if you played the PS2 games before this one, you're going to be very happy here. Now, A Crack in Time took Quest for Booty's increased focus on exploration and expanded it tenfold. There aren't as many planets to visit compared to previous games in the series, but each planet has much more to explore thanks to new equipment like the hover boots, allowing you to go to a bunch of different places. Also, there's space exploration. Yeah, you heard me right. You can fly the ship around different sectors of space, only on one plane, but still. There are tons of these little moons to find, all of which bring back the spherical gameplay of going commando and up your arsenal. They hold collectible goodies at the end, so you're encouraged to explore each one. Arena battling is back as well, of course, like other entries in the series, and it's just as good. What this game introduces that they never brought back again for future releases for some reason are Constructo weapons. You have the Constructo pistol, bomb glove and shotgun. They can be customized with different barrels and explosive effects. It's a really cool system and I don't know why they never brought it back. Now, this game does have a cutscene that brings you up to speed on the story of Tools of Destruction and Quest for Booty, narrated by Captain Cork, but I've just played those games first. They're still fantastic. The Future Trilogy is an absolute must-play, and you can definitely start here if you're new to the franchise. But for a little bit there, people thought A Crack in Time might be the last Ratchet & Clank game, ending on a very high note, but, as we will see, that turned out to be false, because now we enter the next era of Ratchet & Clank, the messy era. And we start here with Ratchet & Clank All for One. So the Future Trilogy was a critical and commercial success. That's good. Unfortunately, Insomniac was a bit burnt out on Ratchet & Clank, so for the next game they wanted to try something different. What they settled on was a 4-player co-op game starring Ratchet, Clank, Quark and Nefarious. The story is that Nefarious has returned yet again, but this time he's been hoisted by his own petards and taken to a mysterious planet along with his mortal enemies. To escape, they have to work together. The cutscenes and writing are surprisingly good here, considering that this has no relevance to the Future Trilogy overall. It's a completely standalone adventure, but an interesting one. I genuinely do like seeing the characters interact with each other in the cutscenes and watching them grow. But I'll be straight up here, I'm not a fan of the gameplay. I don't play Ratchet & Clank for the multiplayer, as I mentioned in the Up Your Arsenal bit. I didn't even mention that Deadlocked had a multiplayer mode. It does. I mean, you can play All for One solo, but you'll always get Clank as your partner, unless you choose Clank as your playable character, in which case you'll get Quark as your partner. But this means that you can't mix and match pairings to hear different bits of banter. For example, you can never pair up Quark and Nefarious to hear how they interact, which sucks. The game has a fixed camera to accommodate for a single screen experience, like most of the Telltale LEGO games. One thing they did keep though is that you can still buy different weapons, and they're mostly fun to use. There's this kind of cool system where if you are shooting an enemy with one weapon and your partner shoots an enemy with that same weapon, you can combine the effects to make a big explosion. Now when playing this game solo, your partner does have decent AI, but there are times when he gets slightly irritating, not massively so, but if you don't have a high tolerance for dodgy AI, I'm just warning you now that he might go a little bit rogue. In terms of visuals, this was the first Ratchet & Clank console game to run at 30 FPS if you ignore the PSP ports. It doesn't feel great if you're coming from those other games that ran at 60 FPS or 50 FPS for the European PS2 games, but that's a whole separate discussion. The art style has changed to make the playable characters similarly sized for the sake of gameplay, being much more chibi-like. Now I don't mind it too much, I think it generally looks quite good, but it's definitely my least favourite in the series. All for One was an interesting experiment, and while it's not bad per se, I can't recommend it if you're new to the series. There are far better games to start with. So let's look at the second game in this messy era of Ratchet & Clank, and what have we got? Ratchet & Clank Full Frontal Assault. What a title. Unfortunately, I don't like this game at all. Okay, so Ratchet & Clank's 10th anniversary was coming up, so what did they decide to make? A short tower defense game. Does it celebrate 10 years of the series? I mean, kind of. His villain is an obscure character from Going Commando, and Quark's ship has the same name as the main hub of Up Your Arsenal, so I guess that counts. Story-wise, the villain has taken down the planetary defense centers of 3 worlds, which means that Ratchet & Clank and Quark have to repair them while also defending against raiders. The performance here is awful. The game has a 30 FPS cap, but to my eyes it hardly reaches it because the amount of enemies and stuff on screen clearly makes the game chug. It does not feel good to hoverboot around shooting enemies when the game turns into a slideshow. You've got to juggle between building turrets and mines around your base, defending it against waves of enemies while advancing forward towards your goal. I suppose it's not terrible if you can stomach the performance and incredibly short length, but it's definitely the worst Insomniac developed game in the series. Please don't start here. Don't make this your first Ratchet & Clank game. Finally, we have Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus. Now this is an interesting one because it's finally back to the traditional style of Ratchet & Clank. Now it may not have the future subtitle, but this was advertised as being an epilogue to the future saga, and while its story isn't quite as good as the future games due to its short length, it does put a nice bow on things. So how does it begin? Well, Ratchet & Clank are stationed aboard a prison ship, moving a new villain called Vendra Prog to another place, but she manages to escape with the help of her brother Neftim Prog, and returning villains Thugs for Less, which appeared in Going Commando. Our heroes chase after the escaped bad guys, which takes them to a supposedly haunted section of the Polaris Galaxy. That's right, I said haunted. This game goes in a spookier direction, literally just for the heck of it. Insomniac just thought it would be fun. There's even an abandoned orphanage with audio recordings that you can pick up, which is very horror game coded. It's not super scary or anything, but the atmosphere is really cool. It's just a fresh experience. The visual style, however, is the same as All for One and Full Frontal Assault, and it has the same crappy performance as the latter, which is unfortunate. Still got a 30 FPS cap, and still hardly reaches it. But the gameplay is back to its classic roots of exploration and combat, and I can't even describe just how happy I was to hear that at the time, and to experience it firsthand. It's not a full-length game, but it has 3 decently sized planets, new weapons and armor, an arena, and even totally new Clank sections. Honestly, I wish this game was longer. I love the spooky vibe, and despite the terrible performance, it feels much better to play than All for One or Full Frontal Assault. Still a far cry from a cracking time, but hey, what are you gonna do? At least it's getting back to that level, you know. Do I recommend it as a starting point though? No. No way. It's an epilogue to the future saga, so my recommendation is to play this after a cracking time, and that's the PS3 era. Next we're going to look at the PS4 era, which has a total of 1 game, and that game, Ratchet & Clank. Just Ratchet & Clank. For a while, it seemed like Into the Nexus was going to be the last Ratchet & Clank game. for real this time. We didn't hear anything for years. However, we then learned about a Ratchet & Clank movie in development, along with a reimagining of the original game from 2002. They were developed side by side, sharing assets along the way. But this is a really weird one. The game's story is a framed narrative, with Captain Quark telling the tale of Ratchet & Clank to his new cellmate, Shiv Helix. In real-world marketing, they called it the game based on the movie based on the game. So what is the story? Well, it's a reimagining of the original game, so it has Drek as the bad guy looking to steal chunks of planets to make a new one for his people. It also has Captain Quark being Captain Quark, Ratchet and Clank first meeting each other, and all the rest of the stuff from the first game. But it also diverges wildly from established canon. The Galactic Rangers are here, but they're these guys, not these guys from Up Your Arsenal. Ratchet now has a mentor where he never did before, and Drek is a crazy idiot voiced by Paul Giamatti, and Sylvester Stallone is his top minion. The game diverges even from the movie by taking our heroes to planets from the original game. They look incredible with the PS4's visuals. And oh man, I have so many mixed feelings about this game. The gameplay is smooth as butter, with almost every weapon being fun to use. Ratchet feels as nimble as he's made out to be. On PS5 it runs at 60 FPS. Seeing planets from the original game reimagined with beautiful graphics is awesome. There's so much exploration here, with collectible trading cards that act as a glossary for the entire Ratchet & Clank series. However, the story is awful. I'm sorry, but it is. The writing is so much worse than anything in the PS3 era, let alone the PS2 era. So many jokes don't land because it feels like they were written for little kids as opposed to young adults. The game was supposedly written by the same guy that wrote the Future Saga, TJ Fixman, and if that's true, what happened? What happened here? The Future Saga is infinitely better than this. Ratchet & Clank's growing relationship, for example, there's no growth whatsoever. It doesn't exist. Sure, Ratchet was a bit too antagonistic in the original game, but here they just cut out the entire concept. They're just best friends right off the bat, and nothing ever changes that. There's no conflict between them whatsoever. It doesn't help that the cutscenes are a mix of movie scenes and low-budget cinematics made by Insomniac. I don't think they had a huge budget for this game, and it shows. The animations made specifically by Insomniac are simplistic and don't match the PS3 games. The way they're spliced together with the movie scenes feels so messy. Also, on PS5, when you enter a movie scene, this annoying notification pops up that you can't disable. Why? And yet, this is natively available on PS4 and PS5, so it's one of the most accessible games in the series right now. So this is where I struggle. I don't know whether to recommend it or not. As a game, ignoring the story completely, it's brilliant. It has the most refined gameplay in the series up to this point, but I also don't want people's first impressions of Ratchet & Clank to be this completely butchered story that has none of the charm of the original. Okay, I've made my decision. I'm going to say no. Don't play this game. Don't start here. If you really want to see how Ratchet & Clank first met each other, play the original PS2 game. And that is all I have to say about that. Now we move on to the PS5 era, and I have a feeling this is also going to have only one game. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. I am so glad this exists. So glad. For years, I was worried that the PS4 reimagining might have been the road Insomniac would go down from then on. Would they reimagine going Commando next or Up Your Arsenal and ruin those game stories as well? But then, Rift Apart was revealed at a PS5 showcase and my fears were put to rest. Mostly. This game is a sequel to the Future Saga. It follows Ratchet and Clank after they've been retired for years, now being celebrated in a festival of heroes dedicated to them. Okay, I was actually a bit worried here because the visuals and Quark saying the Hall of Heroes was saved indicate that the PS4 game is the canon origin, but fear not. In a live stream, a couple of Insomniac developers said that the PS4 game is just Captain Quark's version of events. Even the bits where he's telling the story to Shiv, all of it, literally all of it, in that PS4 game is just his fantasized version of reality. But because he's telling the story at this festival of heroes, he's using his version of events, not what really happened. So the original 2002 game is still the true story, warts and all. Anyway, Dr. Nefarious shows up at this festival and decides to steal something called a Dimensionator. You'll have to play the Future Saga to find out what that is and why it's so significant. Nefarious tries to use it, but things go wrong and it sets off a dimensional cataclysm, taking Ratchet, Clank and Nefarious to another dimension where Nefarious always wins. Yep, this game is a multiverse story. You'll spend the majority of your time in the universe of Emperor Nefarious, who is mysteriously absent. There's also a new playable character called Rivet, who is a Lombax. But who is she really? I won't spoil it, but I will say that she's brilliantly voiced by Jennifer Hale and is a great addition to the cast. There's also one other character here that I adore, and you'll know exactly who I mean when you get to them. The writing is better than the PS4 game by a country mile, and it really pulls on the heartstrings at points. It deals with themes of guilt, self-worth, and learning to trust others in a bleak universe filled with oppression. I don't think the moment-to-moment dialogue is as good as the Future Saga, because it does feel a bit sanitized at times, but it's good stuff overall. It has a good heart. Also, the ending is amazing and pulls the whole thing together, setting up for a sequel that will be here in 2029? Oh my. The gameplay is the best it's ever been in terms of control and combat. This is peak Insomniac. All for One and Full Frontal Assault are a distant memory. It is missing a couple of features from past games though, like swimming and some of Clank's moves. He actually says at one point that he has a jetpack, but we never get to use it, which is so weird. There also isn't anything like racing or space combat, which is a shame, but the reason for that is because what is here is developed with so much attention to detail and seemingly with 10 times the budget of the PS4 game that I almost can't believe it. It's just amazing seeing the difference between the two. It is a full-length game, but a tad short for my liking. I would have loved more planets to explore, but again, that's because they put so much detail into what's already here. This game was developed with the aim of attracting new fans, so you don't need to have played any of the previous games to enjoy it. That's why they have the Festival of Heroes at the beginning of this game. It's a quick refresher for anyone who doesn't know what a Ratchet or a Clank is. Therefore, I can highly recommend Rift Apart to anyone who wants to start their journey through this franchise. And that's that. That is every single game in the Ratchet & Clank franchise, apart from going mobile and before the Nexus. So I see 3 starting points here. For those who don't mind dated visuals and can get their hands on them, the PS2 games are my recommendation. They're some of the best games of that era. For those who can't stomach going back as far as the PS2 and want something more up to date, the Future Saga is a great place to go. That's Tools of Destruction, Quest for Booty, A Crack in Time, and Into the Nexus. Ignore All for One and Full Frontal Assault unless you're morbidly curious. And for those who want to start with the most recent entry, Rift Apart is made for you. If you enjoy it, you can always go back to explore the rest of the franchise. Just don't play the PS4 game. Great gameplay, but the story is awful. And that's that. Those are my recommendations. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I also have a video on the PS2 games you might be interested in and how they run on the PS Plus Premium service, which you can find right here. But with that said, have a great day or night, whatever, wherever you are, and I will see you next time.